Thank you for coming today. And today's session is going to be about Azure Site Recovery. How many of you have used Azure Site Recovery? Okay, quite a good. So you know about Azure Site Recovery more than I do. So, sorry?
Scope in the competition.
Okay.
I actually use a product which is a competitor to Azure Site Recovery.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Yeah. So, my name is Janaka Rangama. I'm not an Australian. I'm an expat hailing from Pearl of the Indian Ocean, that is Sri Lanka. And I'm a principal consultant at Empire. We're just down the street there. And I'm a Microsoft MVP on cloud and data center management space. So I do a little bit of OMS, Azure, everything in my spare time when I'm not sleeping. I'm also a Azure advisor, and I'm a technical evangelist for a company called Fi9, where they do security-related products for Hyper-V, Azure. I'm one of the co-leads of this user group. Written 2 books. One is coming up about Azure Stack, which you can pre-order in Amazon, and you can visit my blog. I blog sometimes when I have time. Okay, so I think this slide is self-explanatory. Every one of us has faced so many difficult situations in our lives, but failure is not an option. When I was a kid, I had a I was not good in following orders, right? So I went into a lot of troubles. So my parents thought that it would be good to train me to adapt some habits, so I picked up reading. So this is one of my favorite books called The Count of Monte Cristo. There's a guy who went through all these troubles in his life, and a lot of people who did wrongdoing to him, and finally he managed to make sure that everyone gets justice. He says this to one of his colleagues about that, in your life you will face so many difficulties, but what makes you a man is what you do when you face a difficulty. So this is true in your life and in your data center. So sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, if something goes wrong in our data center, maybe a couple of servers or something like that, what we do is we try to restart the server, or we just kick the server, right? So I'm going to tell you, with Azure Site Recovery, even though if your data center caught in a fire, there is a way for you to recover. Okay, business continuity. One thing about business continuity is people think that you should implement a business continuity plan or maybe a disaster recovery plan in time of a disaster. No, in every company there is a policy saying this is our business continuity plan. It is not only related to IT, but it is related to other services as well. For an example, you have a fire evacuation plan, right? That is part of your business continuity plan. So IT is just a function in your organization's business continuity plan. So it makes sure, having a business continuity plan makes sure that you will be able to provide the same service to those who require that, right? So natural disasters can happen. You might have a kind of like a fire in your office, right? So you need to evacuate. Now, business continuity is all about providing continuous service in such cases. Now, when we take the IT pillar of business continuity, there are certain challenges attached with it. For an example, if I want to implement a disaster recovery solution for my data center, I might need to spend on another DR site, spend some money on another set of hardware, maybe hire a couple of people, right? And I need to make sure that I have to do a couple of manual interventions here and there. Now, all these challenges are involved by when we implement a disaster recovery plan into our business continuity solution. Now, the biggest thing here is, no matter how you want to automate your disaster recovery solution, it will always have a human interaction. Reason being, we are just mere humans. When a disaster hits, we get panicked. Nobody's gonna look at which button to click to automate everything when a disaster happens, right? So that's a universal fact. But we should make sure that we should automate whatever we can to prevent any errors that will happen after our disaster recovery solution or the plan has been kicked off. The other thing is, now even though we do backups and DR solutions alike, how many of us are really testing that, right? For an example, if you do tape backups and store the tapes in a magnetic vault, and after 10 years somebody wants to recover a file, it was stored in a magnetic vault, so the data is gone. The magnetic power destroys the tape, right? And most organizations, they don't test their business continuity plan, they don't test their backups, right? Couple of reasons. People just take backups, people just replicate their workloads, that's it. But if you want to perform a test like a fire drill for your data center, it will involve a downtime. It will involve a production downtime if you want to test a production level outage. But what if I tell you with Azure Site Recovery, you can test it without having any production impact. You can test what are the services that are no longer functional. You can check whether, okay, can I isolate an environment and try whether this is working. So I'm going to explain you about the different types of testing and production level simulations we can do with Azure Site Recovery moving forward. Okay. Before I tell anything, the most important fact is disaster recovery is not high availability. I had a good customer back in Sri Lanka, a reputed bank. They wanted to implement a Hyper-V replica solution so that they used a one Hyper-V host in their primary data center, another one in their DR data center. They only had a couple of virtual machines to replicate. And when I asked them, okay, this is your disaster recovery solution, what about your high availability? The CIO was saying, no, this is high availability, right? So basically it's wrong. For an example, if one server that I had in that primary data center goes off, I don't have any availability at that location, right? So disaster recovery begins where high availability ends. So we are happy with deploying one server for your application, it goes offline, that's fine. But when we evolve with our workloads, we need to make sure that our location has more capability to provide a better SLA. So that is where we deploy our workload into maybe Windows clusters, Linux clusters, so that hardware failure of one compute node or a VM doesn't affect us. But what will happen if the entire building gets into a fire? That is where you need a DR site. So this is the typical concept. Now if you narrate this into Azure words, you have virtual machines running that contains your apps, and you will deploy a couple of virtual machines in an availability set to make sure that you have highly available infrastructure plus for your applications. But the next step is, if Australia East goes down, like you said, out of capacity, it gets caught into fire, I should be able to resume my workload from my paired region. Now I'm pretty much sure that you know these two, what RTO is and what RPO is. Recovery time objective is, it says that how long can the service be down? Basically, if I have a disaster, how quick I want to start my service. It can be 1 hour, it can be 4 hours, it can be 10 hours. It depends on your definition. Recovery point objective is how much data can I afford to lose. For an example, if I just back up once a day, if I just back up my SQL database once a day, that means every 24 hours, that means the data I have is 24 hours old. So my RPO is 24 hours. Now, if you talk about the resiliency in these three areas, backup, disaster recovery and high availability, one can say I'm just fine with backup. No. When you evolve, when your organization evolves with the current infrastructure, you need all three. Why? You need to make sure that you can cater for every possible scenario that might arrive in your data center. I mean, like, it's like you lost all your money, you lost all your credit card, everything, but still you should be able to stand on your feet. That is what business continuity is all about. I mean, I can live probably $1 a day. I have done that before. So when we talk about backup, sometimes the customers, the peers I meet say, look, if I have high availability, do I still need to make sure that I take backups? Yes. What will happen if those compute nodes and everything goes down and I will lose the storage I have, right? There's no way for me to recover because I haven't taken a copy of the data, right? So it should be, I should always first take the backups, then I should plan for high availability, and finally I should plan for disaster recovery. Okay, Azure Site Recovery. I've been working with the Azure Site Recovery team for like 3 years now, and been working with Azure Site Recovery projects for almost 2.5 years. I find it as a Swiss Army knife. I will tell you why. Now, I had a couple of challenges when I'm deploying a business continuity solution in my data center. One is what? I can't test this. Basically, I need to test this solution ad hoc, right? Every 6 months, every 8 months, but I need to test this in an entirely isolated environment. With Azure Site Recovery, you can do test failovers to a completely isolated network, check everything is fine, and once you say, okay, this test is done, all the resources that were running there will be deleted automatically. And you can do planned and unplanned failovers. So basically, what is a planned failover is a production level simulation that you do on your target DR site, where you will have an actual DR situation. You will create DR situation in your primary data center and make sure that everything will go as planned in case of a disaster. Unplanned is basically something goes wrong, there is no other way than to invoke the DR. And the other thing is, now if I have a 3-tier application or a custom web application or any type of application, I need to make sure that the things start and stop in the order they are supposed to. For an example, I have an application server, a domain controller, and a database server. So if I turn on the application server first without starting the DC or the database server, I might not have the data and I might not be able to log in even. So I should be very conscious about to start the AD first and the database server and then whatever the application server. So I need to make sure that I have a flow. So in order to support that, Azure Site Recovery provides you a way to create recovery plans, right? So when you create a recovery plan, you just say, okay, I'm going to start these bunch of VMs first and these next, and in between you can add actions. For an example, if I want to run a logon script after a certain number of VMs have been started, I can insert that as a manual action for post action or a pre action, right? And the other thing is, you can have fully automated disaster recovery with Azure Site Recovery. Yes, it is possible. My ultimate goal of DR is having the data from my smoke detector to detect a fire and invoke a webhook that will actually start my DR plan. So that is something that I've been thinking for a long time, rather than going and clicking the button. So if somebody goes to the data center and smokes there, have a smoke there, so my DR will probably kick in because it's considered as a valid fire, right? And the other thing is, Site Recovery supports a couple of platforms. It supports not only disaster recovery but migration as well. So you can replicate your workloads that are in VMware to Azure, or Hyper-V to Azure, Hyper-V to Hyper-V, VMware to VMware. And today's topic is how you replicate workloads between two regions that is hosted in Azure. So from Australia East, how you replicate that to Southeast. Also, it supports migrating workloads from other clouds like AWS, or you can, for an example, you get like 100 VMs, 100 physical servers to migrate as it is to the cloud. You can just use Azure Site Recovery to migrate those physical servers once and for all to the cloud. So this is pretty much what I just described. So there are a couple of scenarios involved. For an example, if you take about Hyper-V, we have Hyper-V environments that are managed by Virtual Machine Manager, and we have environments that are unmanaged, right? If I want Azure Site Recovery to control be it site to site or site to Azure type of a replication, if it's a managed solution by VMM, I need to make sure that VMM is the trigger that manages everything. If it's just an unmanaged site like pure Hyper-V host you have there, Azure Site Recovery will directly talk to the Hyper-V host or the cluster and do the disaster recovery for you. And one thing is, it supports VMware as well. It supports heterogeneous OSs, Linux, Windows alike. Okay, DR for Azure VMs. If you want to have a DR solution for your Azure VMs, there are a couple of things that you need to know first. For an example, I want to have a DR solution for my domain controllers that are on-premise. What is the best way? It's just to have a connection between your sites and have another domain controller deployed in your other data center. If I have a SQL, say for an example, a SQL cluster, what is the best way? Do I want to replicate, or what is Microsoft recommendation? Microsoft recommends you to use always on availability groups. Basically, it replicates whatever you have in a primary site into a couple of extended replica destinations, right? Bear in mind, you can replicate a domain controller using Azure Site Recovery. You can replicate a set of SQL servers using Azure Site Recovery, but it is not the recommended method, especially for those two workloads, right? So no matter who comes and tell you I can do Azure Site Recovery, replicate between, and I can use another product to do the same thing, so it doesn't matter. It actually matters, because if you are using a replication method to replicate the domain controllers and SQL servers like that, Microsoft Directory Services team and the SQL Server team, they are not recommending it. So the recommended method for SQL Server is always on availability groups. Recommended method for domain controllers is AD replication. And the other challenges and the considerations we need to have when we consider a DR solution for IaaS is, how soon can we make sure that our solution is up and running. For an example, I have a web front end in Australia East and a back end in Australia Southeast. Sorry, another front end in Southeast, that is my DR side. So how would I make sure, right, the customers or the people who are accessing my website won't notice if there's a DR? So we can leverage something like Azure Traffic Manager, which can load balance the DNS traffic to the front end, so that people who comes to visit my website or whatever the hosted there won't feel a thing. So my traffic manager, it's like a watchdog. It always watch, okay, who's up. If this guy is up, I can set preference to always redirect the traffic to site A, or not. If not, I can set the preference to go to site B. That is one way. Or if I can, in another case, I can do DNS round robin. But in our case, for Azure Site Recovery, combining it with Azure Site Recovery, we will use that preferred one site method. As I said, we need to make sure without production impact, how do we do DR drills? And of course, when an audit comes, people will ask, okay, you have a DR solution, have you tested this? So we need to make sure, okay, I can do a DR just now. And most importantly, I need to make sure that this is not going to be an additional cost to my IT budget. If you wanted to implement a DR scenario for your Azure IaaS workloads before Azure to Azure replication, you would either have to use an active deployment where you have bunch of VMs running here, bunch of VMs running there, right? Use a method like DNS round robin or a DNS preferred failover to make sure that if this side goes down, this side is up to cater. But the thing is, you are paying double. You are paying twice compute because site A and site B are both up at the same time. And not all applications support this method. And Microsoft claims that they have redundant data replication for storage accounts and all this stuff. But if you want to use Azure Storage purely to build a replication solution, it has a higher RTO and it's quite complex as well. And I can't, Microsoft can't guarantee application consistency. For an example, if I want to do that with SharePoint, they can't guarantee that the data that is there, it will be the same as whatever there was when the DR happened. Unfortunately, I will have to highlight this. If you are using a third-party product, you are paying again for that product. Plus, some products are, most of the products supports only active replication, right? And they will support only data replication, not application management. So site recovery is actually application aware and consistent. So this is a comparison on the three methods I just described versus Azure Site Recovery. So simplicity in the sense, when I do the demo, you will see how easier it to start the recovery plan. And no impact DR drill means I can test this entire solution in an isolated network environment, a test environment. And if I use this solution within Azure, the data replication happens between Azure data centers which have gigabit links. So the failover and failback is pretty much instantaneous. Okay. The other thing is, no, it is really good. Now I can replicate all these stuff to another location. However, I have some hidden requirements in any application. For an example, if I have two servers in an availability set, I need to make sure in my DR location, those two servers should also belong into an availability set. If I have a load balancer in my primary data center, I should be able to have the same load balancer in my DR data center, and when I do the DR, it should provide the same level of service, right? Now these things that I just discussed will belong into those pre-actions, post-actions category. If you visit this link, it contains 5 to 6 runbooks, Azure Automation runbooks, which you can deploy to an Azure Storage, Azure Automation account, And from there, inside your disaster recovery plan, you can call them to provide that actions, that scenarios that I've just described. For an example, I will show you in my demo. I'm using one of those automation runbooks which will actually connect the VMs I have in my solution into their respective load balancers in the DR side. So either I can create the load balancers on the fly and join them, or I can create the load balancers beforehand with the configuration rule, and just when the DR happens, after all the VMs are up, I can make sure that a script runs and connects them to the respective load balancer. So it doesn't cost me anything to run the Azure load balancers, so I will just pre-create them before the failover. So you don't have to deploy any servers to do site recovery for Azure VMs. So it's a software as a service, and it supports, most importantly, you can do the failback as well. A little ago, not just little, some time back, you could do the VMware failover to Azure with site recovery, but you couldn't do the failback. But now it supports with failback as well. Now, okay. Another thing about, now the people is ask, okay, this is great. Now you replicate all this stuff within 2 Azure regions. How does it all work? Couple of things first. If you want to implement an Azure to Azure DR solution, it will always have to be within a paired region. For an example, I can't do from Australia East to India West. So my paired, or the sister region, will be Australia Southeast. Every Azure data center has a regional pair. So as long as your data center has a regional pair, you can do the replication to that other region. And the other thing is, if you have network security groups blocking or controlling your virtual network's outbound traffic, you need to make sure that you allow the Azure Site Recovery replication traffic from and to your target and the source network. So Microsoft has created a script basically which is available in TechNet, which you can run once, and it will create all the NSG rules you need in the source and the target. And there are specific guidelines on how you connect with it with your hybrid connectivity solutions that you have, maybe with ExpressRoute or VPN. I have a set of links at the end of my slide, which you will find it useful when you want to deploy the solution. It will contain all this information about that. And one thing I find very challenging about this piece, about the connectivity, is although Microsoft has provided this script, the defined IP ranges that they have in Azure data centers fluctuate. It changes every month, right? So that is something that Microsoft hasn't worked out yet. But the script dynamically downloads the list of available IP addresses from internet, but I don't know, they might have changed the IP addresses last night, and we might have the old list still. Okay. In our typical application infrastructure in Azure, we might have 3-tier application, web front end, and we'll have a couple of app servers and database servers. We'll have load balancers, right? And we might be using public IP addresses for the load balancer to connect, which all stays within a VNet. The typical scenario would be like this. As I mentioned, if you want to qualify your workloads for Azure Site Recovery, replicating SQL, it's not recommended. It's better if you can implement SQL always on, but if you have just one VM that is running SQL, you can do that. You can be like my old customer who said the higher availability and the disaster recovery is same and just replicate it. They actually do that, and it contains the actual production customer details, all the account details. So imagine.
I think it depends always on RTO and RTO.
Yep.
If you have a SQL database, usually you have really important data on there,
Yeah.
So you don't want to have a high RPO and RTO. So
But yeah,
implement those
but surprisingly, what they told us was they were using another third-party replication engine, not obviously Certo, a different one. You can obviously guess what the other is. And they were saying we were spending like 10,000 US dollars for this, and we didn't get a better RPO RTO with that. But with this, it's quite good. And they wanted it to implement in their Maldives branch as well.
Or you do log shipping, which is
Yep.
another poor man's DR.
Poor man's DR, yeah. So for the people who have worked with site recovery, I think this picture explains one real challenge with this solution that we have right now. Can you just tell me what that is? It's right there in the picture.
Storage is outside your VNet.
Yeah. You came closer. It's about in storage as well. You can only do this. This Azure to Azure Site Recovery is right now in preview, right? It's not GA, and you can only replicate your virtual machines that uses storage accounts. But Microsoft is now recommending to use managed disk, so customers who are using managed disk in their VMs can't use this solution to replicate their VMs. So this question was asked back from a couple of customers and partners and MVPs from the PG, and all they said was, by design, in my next slide, if you see, they use cached storage accounts to replicate the data. So there's an intermediary store where you replicate the data back to the DR data center. So they have to use storage accounts, but they are working on adding managed disk support for replication. So basically, if you have managed disk, you can replicate it to another Azure region pretty much soon. If you have a Hyper-V or a VMware workload that you want to replicate to Azure, once you do the failover, you can just in VM setting you can say use managed disk. So those VMs you can use managed disk. But if you want to do Azure to Azure Site Recovery, you will still have to have storage accounts for your VMs. Unfortunately, for managed disk, it doesn't support, which makes sense because it's still not GA, it's preview.
Do we have a time frame for that?
End of this year, that is what I got about 4 p.m. today. So, as I mentioned, for any application consistent DR, I need to make sure everything boots in the proper order, and any application specific configuration, like I mentioned, any boot scripts, adding VMs to a availability set, right? Doing another couple of scripts running, checking a couple of other services are up or not. All this can be done within a recovery plan that we deploy to Azure Site Recovery. And you need to make sure that you have a proper network planned before. For an example, it's pretty much evident that site A and site B should not have the same IP ranges, otherwise there will be a DNS conflict, right? But in my demo, it's actually conflicting. They uses the same thing, but it still works. And the other thing is, you need to make sure that there's a minimum downtime, and most importantly, you need to make sure that the intervention, the human intervention that requires is minimum. So that is why we have all these considerations to take into account when we plan our DR solution with site recovery. Okay, how it works. Now I have a VNet in Australia East maybe, and I have a set of VMs which are being stored in a couple of storage accounts. So when I enable replication for these VMs, these will be replicated through an intermediary cache to my destination data center. So what will be replicated? The VM disks. If I have any availability set in between, I can make sure that that is also replicated. So if I use just the default configuration when I enable the replication, I can even create the virtual network, and it will just have VNet. If it is VNet A, the name will be VNet A-ASR, but it is not recommended. I'll tell you why. If you do that, you will be duplicating your address space, but you can go with the default configuration, plus later you can just change the IP addresses that you have before you do an actual failover. When a DR happens, when you invoke the DR, or if there's an actual DR, Site Recovery turns on the VMs that you had in the cold storage in your DR site, right? So it will be coming up in the secondary site. It will be belonging to the same availability sets that you mentioned, but you need to make sure that you add them to target load balancers you have pre-created or you creating in the runtime, right? And if there are any public IPs to be associated, that also you need to take care at this site. So the compute and the storage will go and the availability sets, that is basically the VM placement, will go to the target site. You need to make sure network plus connectivity is integrated with your recovery plan. Pricing. This is one of the most important thing. Region to region, there's an egress. It is directly proportional to the data churn. For an example, if I don't have if I have like 100 megs of data churn every 5 minutes, my egress every 5 minutes will be that 100 meg. So the additional storage cost I have on the recovery side will be the exact same as my primary side, because it's just the same data I'm replicating. You don't need to run any other infrastructure to replicate, but if you have a domain Active Directory environment, it is always recommended to have a backup domain controller in the other side and enable the AD replication. So I'm replicating from one virtual network to other virtual network. There's something called VNet peering, which is not supported with cross regions. So you can do a site-to-site VPN between the VNets just to make sure that your SQL always on traffic goes through, plus your AD replication traffic goes through. And the licensing cost is same as on premises to Azure. So it is free for 31 days. So you can use this for 31 days without paying anything. So you can replicate the initial set of data without paying anything. Then afterwards you will be paying a rent per VM that you are replicating. I can't remember the exact amount that you have paid, like 50 something like that, yeah?
Plus the storage, isn't it?
Yep.
It's less than the VM cost.
Okay, protecting IaaS VMs with ASR. As usual, I haven't tested my demo. I hope that works.
Hey, last time I did this in front of a customer was embarrassing.
It worked or did not?
It took me 5 attempts to fail over a VM with Azure SRM.
Okay, right.
All the best.
Now there's this site called Azure Quick Start Templates, where I can just get any template and deploy an application from there. So there's a template called deploy a SharePoint server with 3 VMs, and there's another template called deploy a 9 server deployment, which is a huge deployment of SharePoint, which you can use. So I'm using that 3 VM template, where I used to deploy a domain controller and a SharePoint server and a SQL server. But if you go and deploy this template now, you will find it won't configure the SharePoint farm because there's a bug in the DSC version that they use. So SharePoint is installed, not configured. But for my demonstration, this is pretty much enough. Now I have replicated all 3 VMs regardless of Microsoft recommendation, right? Just to showcase that we can do replication for any number of VMs. So if I had a multi-tier application, I need to make sure that Active Directory should be taken off from the ASR. SQL should be taken off from the ASR. The rest you can just replicate. Alright, so the first step is to create a recovery service vault, which I have created. It's pretty simple. If I go to recovery services vault, I can create new one, right? And I have already done that. So if I go to the recovery services vault that I have created, first thing I should do is going to.
Can you increase the font size?
Okay.
So it's quite small.
Is it okay? Well, I'd use zoom in.
Scroll.
Yeah, it's better to use zoom in. Okay. Now here, first thing I need to make sure is my site recovery infrastructure is set up. Basically, I need to make sure that the network mapping has been properly done. So given that I have two networks in place, first thing I'm going to do is do the network mapping, right? So I can map my target source to target and target to source. Why? Because I will be doing fail over and fail back. That is the first thing. If you don't have a target network and if you are lazy to create the subnets and all this stuff again, right, just go with the default settings which will replicate your network, but it will have the same IP addresses. So before you do an actual failover, you can go to the target network and change the IP address space. That's it. That's the easiest if you have multi-subnet, multi-NSG type of a deployment. Alright. Then if I go to, what is that? So this is the landing page that you get when you set up a Azure Site Recovery Vault. If I go to prepare infrastructure, first I need to set from where to where I'm going to set my replication. So I'm going to select Azure to Azure, right? It says in preview. The next step is to prepare the source, right? Okay, this is done. Okay. Oh, it's been configured. That's why. Okay. The next step here is to prepare the source. Now this is where it asks about what are the virtual machines you want to replicate, right? And when you come to this stage, it will ask you, okay, you have this set of virtual machines. Shall I go ahead with the default settings where I create a virtual mesh network on my own and all the availability sets on my own on the other data center, and they will isolated by something called -ASR. So if you have VNet A here, it will be VNet A-ASR, right? And there's a default replication policy where you can keep your copies for 24 hours. You can change that as well. So if I am to deploy this solution, I will just go with the default settings because I don't want to create all the subnets there and do the mapping manually, but just create the network there and after change the IP address space. Once you have configured the replication, it will do an initial replication. Even though we talked about this is between gigabit links, for these 3 servers it took me like 2 or 3 hours. Then I queried why it took so many hours, and I found out I have like 5 terabytes of data to replicate. I had in this template it actually adds 2 or 3 data disks into every server. So altogether about 5 or 6 terabytes of disks were there to replicate. Now once I have done this and enabled the replication, I can go to replicated items and see the progress of my replication. Now here all the VMs are protected. That means initial replication has been done. Sorry. If I select one VM, and if I go to compute and network, okay, you can't change these settings until the initial synchronization has been done, right? So if you just enable ASR and go to this place for these VMs, you will see it will complain about wait until this initial synchronization is done. Now if you use this Azure Site Recovery solution from on-prem to cloud, and if you have massive amount of data, you can ship your disks you can ship your VHDs, copy them into a couple of actual hard disks and ship to the Azure data center so that they will plug that in there, and whatever the delta that has been built up from now to the ship date will be synced afterwards.
Can you pause the initial replication? So let's say you synced 2 VMs,
Yep.
but you want to pause it because of network congestion, for example.
It's not pause. The initial replication you can actually cancel from the jobs, not pause. There's no pause option there. So here, as you can see, it does the mapping on source and target. Now if I find the size on the target environment is not enough for my VM, I can just change that, right, and save this setting so that when I invoke the DR, the new size will come up. So it says, so for an example here, I have an availability set called SQL availability set. I use the default setting, so it created another availability set called ASR. That's it. It doesn't create any load balancers. Remember, it doesn't create any public IP addresses for you. Those you need to take care of, which I will show you in the next section. And the network mapping there, and here what are the source subnet and the target subnet on both network. So if I want to do an IP change, right, and add a static IP address in the target site, I can just mention that IP address from my VNet, right? So that every time this VM failovers to that target network, I will pick up not the available IP but the IP that I have mentioned. Okay. Now I've talked about, if you go here, you can see what data being replicated, right? What is the data churn? I don't have anything there. And then I talked about the availability sets, and then load balancers and public IP addresses, right? Now in my demonstration, in this template I used, I have 3 availability sets. Inside all these availability set, 1 VM, and I have a load balancer in each, connected to each VM, 3 load balancers, which will just allow RDP, right? Now if I go to load balancers, okay, if I go to load balancers, as you can see here, AD, SharePoint, SQL, these are the original load balancers. Now I need to have the same in my target environment, so I created them manually. I use a PowerShell script to create that, just to replicate the same thing, right? And I have connected a public IP address to this load balancer. So these load balancers are now external load balancers, just to give RDP connectivity to my machines. I have connected that. But in your case it might be different. You might be using express route to connect, so you don't need external connectivity. You will just use an internal load balancer, because although your site is down, your express route connection to DR site will be still up.
Or you might have something like a NetScaler with
Yep.
GSLB
Configuration, yeah.
Just passes on the traffic.
Okay. Now if I go to the recovery vault again, I can actually do failover 1 VM at a time, which makes no sense if you want to do a full test, or if you don't want like clicking all the time when you want to do the failover. So I can actually create something called a recovery plan, where this is a recovery plan I've created. If I go inside this recovery plan and customize it, you can see I have 3 virtual machines belonging to one group starting in this order. So before we do the actual failover, all the VMs in my source location will be turned off, and then from the cold storage that was replicated, they will start up the VMs. Then I need to make sure all this stuff that I just described is happening afterwards. So I have added the script to add the VMs to the load balancers I have pre-created, right? So this script is actually in an Azure automation account. I will showcase that as well. So I didn't create any script on my own. So all these scripts are available from Microsoft. So as you can see, these are the possible scenarios that they tell you. For an example, you need to add multiple VMs to multiple load balancers, and then you want to do always on availability group failover when you do the actual failover for your databases. You can do that manually from SQL Server Management Studio. I have one customer who's doing like that. But if you know the databases and connection string and all this stuff, you can just automate that and put all the inputs into this runbook, and you can add as a pre-step before the application server failover, so that before the application servers comes in, the databases have been failed over automatically, right? Okay, now how do we do a DR test? I'm not going to do a test, I'm going to do a production failover. So I test my scenarios in production. If I go to recovery plans, I have a couple of options. I can do a test failover. If I select this option, I will need a test network, which is like a blank network, to test this. And once I finish the failover, Azure Site Recovery will delete all those items that was left there. I'm going to do a production level failover. And it will say you haven't performed a test failover in past 6 months. Yeah, I understand the risks, right? And pay attention for this, change direction. If I failed over from A to B, then I need to, once this is failed over, I need to make sure, okay, everything is up. I'm committing this failover, and then I'm saying, okay, reverse the replication from B to A, because in my whatever that changes I do in the DR side should be replicated to the other side as soon as it comes up. It should be available, right? So when you do the failover and when you do the failback, you can change the direction where you want to do this, right? And the recovery point, I can select the latest, that is the lowest RPO, or the lowest RTO, or the latest application consistent. So I have 3 options. I'm going with the latest recovery point objective.
Could you have more points, or is that?
You can have more application recovery points there as well.
So it's not just 3 that you can use?
No, this is not just this is actually not the actual recovery point, right? So this is actually about up to what level you want to recover the data. For an example, if I go with app consistent, I'm pretty much sure that in the next window it will give me a list of app consistent recovery points I've taken, but I am not sure in my default settings I've enabled any application consistency. So if I just select this and say failover, now all I have to do is wait.
Can't you actually recovery point you want to fail over to?
I can, but here I haven't configured any application consistent recovery points in my settings. So if I had done that, I should be able to select the point.
But is it mandatory to configure that in order to
No.
get parallel checkpoint?
No, so it's like this. It is recommended to use application consistent recovery points if your workload supports application consistency. For an example, if it's like SharePoint, you can go with that. If it's just file servers, it doesn't matter. It's just the data you want to replicate, right? Now here, all the VMs are being shut down. I tick the box saying shut down the VMs before I do the actual failover. So this plan will execute. Now the beauty of this thing is, during each of these steps, I can add something called a manual action, right? Where that guy who performs the DR can go out for a coffee and comes and check everything, all done, type, enter, then it will proceed to next. So you can do a cascading sort of a DR scenario. That means manual human intervention that your IT team might require, right? The other thing is, you might need to have different recovery plans for different reasons, right? But the first plan, now this one was called production. If I want to have another plan with another plan, same VMs, but for a different environment, right? You can actually use PowerShell and export this recovery plan into an XML, change all the settings there, and you can just upload it to PowerShell and create another plan. I find that is the most effective way if I want to replicate the changes or replicate a recovery plan to another environment, because you don't want to create all these scripts and all this stuff again when you want to do this. Now let's see what is actually happening in our for our VMs. I will go to, where's that, recovery service vault. So ideally I should be getting the message saying a failover in progress. Okay, failover was initiated. Once the VMs are failed over, you can't just leave and go. You need to make sure everything is up, and you need to commit that failover. Once you do that commitment of the failover, the link is severed. So basically that means no replication is happening from A to B. Commit is done, then you enable reprotection where B is replicating back to A. In a production environment, you will only do the reprotection if your site A is up. For an example, if I do a VMware to Azure scenario, if my hardware is crashed, I can't reprotect unless I have the same cluster built up there, right? So these are the considerations that you need to think before you do an actual DR. Any questions? It's pretty easy, I know, right? And one good thing I found about this product is I've been working with different Microsoft teams, product groups. Azure Site Recovery product group, they're really responsive. I mean, they will literally reply to you within the hour. So that is very responsive compared to some other teams at Microsoft, right? And they are continuously improving the solution. So while this is being failed over, we will see the rest of the updates that I have here. Okay. So let's turn though. Oh, I'll just go with this. Okay. Site recovery now supports role-based access control. So if you just want to give the DR people the access only to perform the DR, there are 3 new role-based access control roles available with Azure Site Recovery. So you need to make sure that if the guy is a site recovery contributor, he can actually initiate a DR. If he's a reader, he can just see the vault, whatever happened, that kind of scenario, right? Linux OS support currently supports Ubuntu, different versions of Red Hat. And what I find most amusing about Red Hat is no matter which version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux or the Fedora version that there is, people are still using Red Hat 5 or Fedora 5 or 6. So for those customers, Microsoft is planning to introduce backward compatibility support. So don't ask me the question whether it supports Windows Server 2003 or 2008. My answer would be yes and no, because officially it is not supported, but if you want to do that, you might just replicate, right? It's not like restricted, right? And Site Recovery now supports replicating disks which are greater than 1 terabyte of size, but if you are doing this from on-prem, right? So you need to make sure that this is from VMware to Hyper-V, VMware to cloud, or Hyper-V to cloud, but not with Azure to Azure Site Recovery. It's still 1 terabyte there in that case.
So what's the max size of a disk which you can have now?
4 TB.
4.
Yeah, one disk 4 TB. And it supports managed disk and availability sets which were not there previously. So if you use managed disk in your if you are using VMware Hyper-V to replicate to Azure, whatever the calls VMs that you're going to turn on there, you can make sure that after the DR happen, they will be managed disk. But in Azure to Azure, still the Azure deployment you have on your primary side should use storage account, which I think they will delay probably the general availability of this solution until they figure out the managed disk support, because it doesn't make sense. Customers are going with managed disk in the production deployment. So if I go to a customer and tell him to use managed disk, and the next day he comes and asks me to do ASR within 2 regions, I'm just it just contradicts what I just said. Site Recovery supports Windows Server 2016 across all platforms, Hyper-V, VMware, Azure, right? And it supports storage spaces, not storage spaces direct, right? Storage spaces direct is pure software defined storage. It's like basically you can deploy a bunch of VMs or physical servers and use the commodity disks to provide a software defined shared storage. For an example, if you want to do a pure failover cluster for SQL in Azure, you need to have shared storage, right? You can't take your hardware boxes there. So the only available option is to use a storage spaces direct deployment to be the shared storage. So it's basically like providing a SAN, in other words. But even though this is software defined storage, the IO capability is really impressive. And obviously you need to use premium disk, which costs you money. That's a drawback, right? Okay, these are the links I mentioned. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, or these slides will be updated later today. I would advise to start with the network mapping first, right, before you do anything, to understand how the network connectivity should be done. And if you are planning a Hyper-V to cloud or a VMware to cloud sort of a deployment, there's a tool called Capacity Planner for Azure Site Recovery, where you can enter the size of the disk you have on premises and the data churn that you would expect, and you can actually get a statistic sheet saying, okay, this much is the cost for the storage, this much you are going to use for compute, all this stuff, right? But it is not available to for the Azure to Azure scenario. So if I have a qualifying workload like something running on storage accounts, I would configure Azure Backup first to back up the entire VM, and then I would plan for Azure Site Recovery. And I sincerely hope that they will introduce the managed disks support pretty soon. As for 4 PM today, what they told me was coming soon before end of this year. So that means you may never know. Let's see whether the failover has kicked in. Okay, failover completed. Cool. We can go to jobs and actually see whether how long did it take, right? Okay, the timing is bizarre.
7 minutes.
Yeah, 7 minutes. Cool. Now the failover has been done. I need to make sure that everything is failover completed, right? Once I do the verification, right? But obviously in a real DR situation I don't have time to do the verification. I will just commit. So it will say, are you sure you want to commit? Once you commit, you cannot change the recovery point of the machine. So if I had application consistent recovery point, that means that is it. I'm committing to this point of time of data and the state of my virtual machine in my DR site. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, you only do the reprotection once this is done if the source environment is available. So if the source environment, Azure data center was down, was caught in a fire, and Microsoft says all good mate, then you can do this reprotection. If it were VMware, if the environment is up, you can do the reprotection. So it will reverse replicate the it will reverse the replication. So it will replicate from B to A. So B will be your primary site. So if you want to make sure that A will become the primary data set again, you will do another failover.
With reprotection, does it do the initialization itself, or do you actually initialize yourself?
It will do the initialization itself, and it will do a synchronization check to see which blocks match what. If the entire, so for an example, if it's an entirely new environment that you are reprotecting, it will do the mega sync, which makes sense. If it was just file failure, it will just do the delta, right? But if you are using VMware to Azure, Azure to VMware scenario, it will take more time because whatever we have there in the cloud is a VHD, here it's a VMDK. So there's a conversion going on. That is the only caveat there, but I have done this for about 100 virtual machines for one of my customers, and the RTO goal was about 4 hours, which we met because they were using an express route connection. And most importantly, people will ask, okay, how can I do this? Can I do this over public internet? Yes, you can if you have a good pipe, right? But if you have an express route circuit, there's something called public peering in express route, where the site recovery traffic, which is going to be in a storage account, goes through a separate channel in your express route connection called the public peering circuit, right? So that is more faster than just going through the local LAN traffic or the internet, right? So if you want to deploy site recovery with express route, make sure that you enable public peering in your express route circuit. So it won't eat up your local LAN traffic in your express route circuit plus internet traffic, right? So this is one step most of the organization fail to perform, and they will complain, oh my god, the traffic is still going through my internet. You can do the throttling as well, but still if you use public peering circuit, which is the dedicated path, you don't have to limit anything. So that's all about it, and the pizza is here. If you have any question, you can just ask me. Okay, commit also completed. Okay, that's good.